But we begin tonight with the Supreme Court, which nowadays is acting more like a super Congress, with last week's rulings on affirmative action and LGBTQ rights, and on everything from voting rights to women's rights, labor policies, and guns. They have acted like unelected politicians and not a court. It's the result of a long game from a right wing that recognizes that they have lost the culture wars. So instead, they say, fine, we can't win at the ballot box, so here's how we're going to enact ultra-conservative policies. The court. It's not just what they personally want ideologically. It is what the billionaires who fund them want, to bypass the public and let these six people do the work for them. As my friend and colleague Mehdi Hasan writes, today's conservative justices are happily imposing their reactionary legislative vision on America, not just by interpreting laws, but by effectively rewriting them in order to implement unpopular policies that could never get passed through Congress. Separation of powers be damned. And unlike the courts of the last century, this court has completely given away the capacity to surprise. You know how each of these right-wing justices are going to rule, and they do exactly what you think they're going to do most of the time. That wasn't always the case. During the court presided over by Chief Justice Earl Warren from 1953 to 1969, Americans could genuinely wonder how the justices might rule on any given case. And you couldn't guess based on who nominated them or how conservative they were. Take Associate Justice Hugo Black, who'd been a member of the KKK as a younger man, yet was part of unanimous rulings in favor of school desegregation and legalizing interracial marriage. Or Justice Harry Blackmun, nominated by Richard Nixon, who wrote the majority opinion enshrining abortion protections in Roe v. Wade. And it was two Reagan nominees and a Bush nominee who joined with the majority upholding reproductive rights 20 years later during the court presided over by Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Another Republican nominee on that court took his conservative colleagues to task for their decision in Bush v. Gore, Justice John Paul Stevens. The right has since succeeded in making a court that will never surprise them again, thanks to its bench of hard right ideologues served up by the Federalist Society. They have, just in the last year, on the John Roberts Court, succeeded in erasing 70 years of protected rights for women, Black Americans, LGBTQ people. And not just because the people who put them on the court are ideologues, but because they themselves are ideologues. Donald Trump put his stamp on the court with three justices, including Amy Coney Barrett. Before Justice Barrett was picked for the federal courts and jammed onto the court despite an impending election, she was a paid speaker 5 times at the Blackstone Legal Fellowship, a summer program established to inspire a distinctly Christian worldview in every area of law. The Blackstone program is run by Alliance Defending Freedom. Now, if you're not familiar with the Alliance Defending Freedom, or ADF, you are familiar with their work. They've been designated an anti-LGBTQ hate group. The ADF represented the Colorado baker who refused to make a cake for a gay couple. And they've been involved in the barrage of anti-transgender bills being considered in states across the country. The ADF also wrote the Mississippi law behind the Supreme Court's decision throwing out 50 years of reproductive freedom in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. And now they're behind the current case to kill the abortion bill mifepristone, an effort funded by billionaires whose names you have heard of or who don't want you to hear them. The Shadowy Donors Trust and Charles Koch and the Charles Koch Institute. Last week, the ADF scored a victory for bigotry and intolerance in the name of Christianity, thanks to this Supreme Court. Representing the evangelical web designer who never made wedding websites but didn't want to make hypothetical sites for LGBTQ couples who didn't exist. The Alliance Defending Freedom wasn't the only shady group backed by right-wing billionaires to have the court do its bidding, turning back the clock last week. The court also ruled in favor of Students for Fair Admissions in killing affirmative action in college admissions. Except Students for Fair Admissions involves no students. Just a 70-something-year-old white conservative activist named Ed Blum, who's waged a long war against anything race-based in public life. Blum orchestrated the challenges that led to Shelby County versus Holder, the court ruling that gutted Black voting rights. and later recruited white student Abigail Fisher in his previous unsuccessful attempt to kill affirmative action in a case against the University of Texas. After that loss, he pivoted, at one point telling a Chinese-American group in Houston, quote, "I needed Asian plaintiffs," but Ed Blum didn't find any. No Asian American students testified against affirmative action. The Asian students who did testify did so in favor of affirmative action. But that didn't matter to this court. It helped that the dean of the School of Legislative Jurisprudence, Clarence Thomas, had his own long desire to kill the program he himself benefited from and thus to pull the ladder up behind him. The same Clarence Thomas whose own votes in cases like Citizens United have pushed dark money into our politics and whose billionaire benefactors do more than just pay for financial goodies and treats for him personally. They also hate the things that he and his right-wing colleagues are so eager to overturn, namely the will of the people. The will of the people apparently be damned. Joining me now is Michael Kirk, documentary filmmaker and director of the PBS Frontline documentary Clarence and Ginni Thomas, Politics, Power, and the Supreme Court, and David Jolly, MSNBC political analyst and former Republican congressman who is no longer affiliated with the party. Thank you both for being here. Michael Kirk, I do want to start with you. I watched your documentary. It was fascinating. I want to play a clip from it for those who haven't seen it yet, and I recommend everybody watch it. And this was something new to me, the nexus between Clarence Thomas and one Rush Limbaugh. Take a listen.
Attention business owners. If you're a business owner, you can get free access to this book, 77 Ways to Get More Customers.
Thomas told people he stopped reading mainstream news. Instead, he relied on two primary sources, his wife and Rush Limbaugh.
He would listen to Rush Limbaugh as he was doing a long commute, and he would have court staff tape record it so he could listen to it when he was commuting.
Your attempt to assuage all of your white guilt by supporting Obama is worthless because you know he's not a real black. If any race of people should not have guilt about slavery, it's Caucasians.
The two became close friends.
The fear was Clarence Thomas has confirmed he then becomes the most powerful, influential black man in America. And he's not a Democrat, and he's not a liberal.
Michael Kirk, it seems to me that the current Supreme Court is now a court of Rush Limbaugh's dreams. How did the right build that?
Well, as you totally set up perfectly. There's a war in the country. It's a culture war, as we know, but it's also a political and a war of about our institutions and in our institutions and the results of what our institutions yield. A lot of trouble about the presidency, a lot of trouble about Congress, but only in the last 40 years or so has the Supreme Court come up for and been put in play, largely by, as you appropriately say, Joy, wealthy individuals who represent the Republican Party, but also represent a change in America. And they've been hunting justices and people who would suit that role for the last 40 years, starting with Robert Bork's case long ago, leading to the creation of the Federalist Society, and then the selection of certain justices, waiting for the right time, all under the tutelage of a name you didn't mention, a film I also just made called about Mitch McConnell, and the power of McConnell to know when to hold them and when to fold them. And it's been fascinating to watch, and it is part and parcel of, I think, the last great fight in our democracy over an institution that people are increasingly feeling it's just not what it used to be. It's not fair. The justices are compromised in lots of ways, especially the conservative justices, and there's no calling them to do for what they've done. So it's a kind of tragic thing that's happening inside the court, and God knows what we used to think of as settled law is now open. It's open season on everything that has ever been passed before, and it comes from these justices who are not only ideologically driven, but are in a war and are warriors in that battle.